Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Spud Smart Roundtable Series webinar. My name is Ashley Robinson, and I'm the editor of Spud Smart. Today, I'll be serving as your host for this webinar. Today's theme is when spraying is bad, herbicide injury on potato plants. And I'd just like to take a quick second to thank McCain for partnering with us on this Roundtable Series webinar. So today's presenters are Vikram Bish, who is the plant pathologist for potato and horticultural crops with Manitoba Agriculture, and then Andy Robinson, who is the extension potato agronomist at North Dakota State University and the University of Minnesota. And at this time, I'd also like to mention that this webinar has been approved to offer 1 CCA credit, and we will show the QR code on screen after the presentation, so please make sure to stick around for that. And okay, so today we're going to be learning about herbicide injury on potatoes, as I said before, and there's a multitude of issues from spray drifting to soil carryover to sensitive varieties that can cause herbicide injury on potatoes. And while it can sometimes only cause a little damage, it can also easily lead to huge losses for your crop. So what can and should you do to protect your spuds? Today you'll learn what herbicide injury in potatoes is, how it happens, and what you can do for your spuds if they get hit. During the presentation, you'll likely have some questions for our speakers. Please type these into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and we'll address them during the question and answer session after the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available at spudsmart.com following this live event. So make sure to check back on our website, and we'll also send you an email to let you know when it's live. And okay, time for our first presentation. So Vikram Bish is, as I said before, the plant pathologist for potato and horticultural crops with Manitoba Agriculture, and he's based in Carman, Manitoba. And Vikram obtained his PhD in plant pathology from the University of Illinois, where he worked on soybean diseases, and then he got his postdoctorate at the International Crops Research Institute for Semi-Arid Tropics in India, where he worked on phytophthora blight on the pigeon pea crop. And prior to joining Manitoba Agriculture, he worked with hydroponic seed potato production facilities in Kunming, China, and then in Maine. In his current position, Vikram works on disease and pests affecting potato and vegetable crops in Manitoba. He is involved with insect pests and disease monitoring, disease diagnosis, surveillance, and on-farm research and extension on diseases and herbicide drift. And he's a cooperator in the Canadian Agricultural Partnership projects on potato late blight in Canada and necrotic viruses, including PMTV in potato. And he's an active member of the Canadian Phytopathological Society and currently serves as the membership secretary for their executive board. He was co-chair of the Potato Association of America Organizing Committee for the 2019 meeting held in Winnipeg, and he has been a member of the organization's seed certification and extension subcommittees. Take it away, please, Vikram.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Spud Smart for inviting me to speak today. I'll go directly into the topic. Non-target herbicide injury is a frequently occurring issue in many crops. Potatoes are particularly sensitive to many herbicides used in the crops surrounding the potatoes. There is a cost of herbicide injury to potatoes, which could be very negligible or be very severe losses. On commercial crops, the losses are in yield reduction and tuber quality. But on seed quality, the losses can be very significant due to possible rejection of the seed lots. And it could also become a problem for next year, the grower who gets the affected seed lots. There's possibility of litigation happening. And so we have to be very careful of reducing these issues for the potato growers. Herbicide injury is possible through various ways, various means. Many of you already know this. Drift from the nearby applications under various conditions which favor the spread of the applied material whether it is too windy, there is no air movement, improper nozzles have been used for the conditions, making very fine mist. Air temperature inversions can be an issue, and proximity to the sensitive crops. Improperly cleaned spray tanks can be an issue in many cases, not many, but it does happen. Misapplication of the wrong product in the wrong field is an issue that happens quite often. Mistimed application of herbicides when, for example, the plants are emerging and the applicator sprays when the plants have already emerged, partly maybe 50%, and did not realize that there were many ground cracks also. So this can lead to issues also. Soil residue is a big issue in some cases, and important to understand how it happens. Sensitive varieties to already registered products on potatoes is an issue that happens sometimes. I'll go into how do you recognize that a herbicide injury has occurred? One of the important things is for people to understand, become familiar with the foliar symptoms of commonly used herbicides in your area. These are some commonly used herbicides that I have used. There may be many more. And it is also helpful to understand what is the distribution pattern. If the symptoms of the injury are fading away from the edge of the field, it is possible that there is a drift associated. There may be other ways to understand how the drift happened. The affected plants are randomly distributed in a field, and it is possibly a seed carryover. And often the concentration in zones could be a soil residue issue. Now, there are some cases where there is no visible injury. This may happen either when the herbicide that has come onto the crop is at very, very low concentrations. But there are cases where, for example, glyphosate has been used on crops for weed control, that is pre-harvest dry down. There is a late season exposure. Unfortunately, in many cases, the injury to the seed lot is not detected by the post-harvest testing that is done for viruses in the labs. And so one of the important things, if there is a suspicion that there may have been some herbicide injury onto the seed crop, it is good to get a grow out test. That is where you will possibly catch some of the issues. I have been called by quite a few growers to visit and find out if there were virus diseases or some other issues in the field. But when I went to many of these fields, they appeared to be either environmental or herbicide issues, and that is how I got involved into working with the herbicide projects. So here on the top right, you see that there is some malformation of the emerging shoots, and these are probably because of the cold or heat at the time of emergence. At the bottom, you have a typical 2,4-D or group 4 symptoms, and many of these will during the season produce normal leaves like you see here, but there is still an important thing to understand what these are. Here I'm showing an example of the glyphosate drift. When the wind is in the wrong direction and you are spraying Roundup Ready soybeans, it is possible that the potatoes can get affected. Here on the bottom right, you see typical symptoms of glyphosate injury. that is the yellowing of the growing shoots and new leaves. It is one of the most common issues that I have seen around. Just to give you an idea that early exposure of the plants at hooking or tuber initial stage is very harmful for the yields and quality of the potatoes. Late exposure, however, that is mid-bulking or later, there is hardly any symptoms produced, or if they are produced, they can be easily missed. But these are actually more harmful to the seed grower. Here is an example of the Liberty from the Liberty Link canola, basically either oversprayed or drifted on because of the light winds towards potatoes. So many people consider the Liberty to be a contact herbicide, but for potatoes, it can be a seed issue as well. This is a very good example. In the spray tracks, the symptoms of typical group 4 symptoms, and these symptoms basically end after a few meters going into the crop, and these symptoms were not seen anywhere else. So clear indication that there was some product left in the spray tank for fungicide applications. Here is a very good example of what can happen if the herbicide is going to be used in the previous crop season. Here it was Assert that was applied on sunflower, and the gravelly areas of the field had extremely poor emergence. The shoots and the roots were very much deformed. Any plant that came in had very typical group 2 issues or symptoms, and this will happen in areas where the soil is gravelly, the low organic matter, or the conditions are very dry. This extends the residual life of the herbicide in the field. So it is important to have good rotation for the herbicides in the potato field program. Here is a very good example of the herbicide damage from group 4. Here you can see I have marked in red the affected plants are well distributed. So if a grower calls me that he has some diseased plants or something else is happening, it's very easy to understand. If you have distributed plants, it is a seed-borne issue. It could be virus or it could be a herbicide damage. It's important to understand what the symptoms look like. Here is another example. Sometimes you have 2 different lots planted side by side for whatever reason. And here you had very poor emergence on the right side, and the plants, they had very typical multiple sprouting. And if you have this kind of field besides a regular or nice looking potatoes, you know there is something wrong and you can have better investigation. Here is a misapplication. There was one sprayer operator who wanted to finish the Odyssey that was used for some other crop. Some product was left in his tank, and he decided to go around the field and spray the product onto the potatoes. Needless to say, this field was rejected by the processor, and here you have really bad-looking potatoes. Sometimes we have varieties which are quite sensitive to registered products. As an example, metribuzin, Sencor. Some of the sensitive varieties could be many reds from the fresh or table market. Columba, Innovator, Ivory Russet, and Shepherdie are particularly most sensitive. They would have veinal chlorosis, as you can see on the leaves here. And when the concentration is high, it would sometimes lead to leaf necrosis as well. Under stressful conditions, even Russet Burbank may show some symptoms of herbicide damage. It could be confused with the virus disease if a single plant is seen. But if you see this kind of symptom in almost the whole field, then you know it is something that was applied. And then you can investigate further and realize that it could be herbicide issue. And after many of these farm visits to identify some issues that came out to be herbicide issues, I decided that it would be good to have everything in one spot. So I initially decided to have 4 herbicides for a demonstration trial. So I used the products, sprayed it using a backpack on 4-week emergent plants of Russet Burbank at 0, 1, 10, and 20% of the application rates. Tubers from this plot were then stored for 2012 planting. This was started in 2011. And I have, it was good to see that typical symptoms of the herbicide damage were produced. It was good for the growers to have a look at it. And, it was very easy to go into the field and compare and see these. And the seed that was saved from 2011 exposure was planted in Winkler research site and also in Portage. Here you can see Odyssey at 10 and 20% basically gave no emergence. Even 1% was highly, detrimental. Glyphosate was not as bad, but it still affected the emergence. Liberty also came out to be really detrimental to the seed performance. However, 2,4-D, the plants seem to be more vigorous, even at 20%. And I was a bit surprised. Even though we see a lot of symptoms, the plants did better. And just coincidence, in my, I happened to be in Portage field that day, and Andy just dropped by. And so he is my co-speaker today. Hi, Andy. Okay, the plots were then harvested, and here, the emergence translated very well into how the yields were. 2,4-D did not affect the yields, or in fact actually increased, whereas the other 3 herbicides, the glyphosate, the Liberty, and the Odyssey, were significantly detrimental to yields, and the effect increased with increasing concentration, which is easily understood. And I did, besides this particular plot, I also had planted a new crop of Russet Burbank to test what would happen for the current season simulated drift issue. And so I selected 7 combinations of herbicide treatments. I will not go into the details, but you can see that the herbicides were quite detrimental to the yields, except for 2,4-D. Here, one thing to note is the glyphosate, when applied late, did not really affect the yields very much. And the glyphosate applied early in the crop season was quite detrimental to the yields. And we'll come back to this again later. So that was 2012 and 2013. I didn't present any data, but after 9 to 10 years of absence, there was renewed interest in showing the impact and the symptoms to the new crop of growers and agronomists. And so I decided to have 8 combinations of the herbicides that are currently used. I used Rustler here, which is a combination of glyphosate and dicamba. There are other combinations that would be available currently. So I used Bactrill, Ingenia, Infinity, Liberty, Odyssey that had been used earlier, early and late Roundup. And so the percentage of application was in this slide. This was 5%, 10%, and 20% rate of applications. And so all along here, we have 20% rate of application. I have Bactrill, Infinity, Odyssey, Rustler, control treatment here, Liberty, Ingenia, and early glyphosate. So in this one, you see that Infinity did a great job on producing beautiful symptoms. You would also notice that the guard rows were not affected. So whoever did the spraying did a good job. We actually used spray boards to protect the side rows, so it worked very well. And I decided to show you what the Infinity symptoms look like because I had not shown earlier. There is a white margin that you can see on the leaves. As the concentration increases, the whitening increases, and then there is also start of necrosis. Here is the plot that we had. Just to give you an idea, again, all of these herbicides at different rates were affecting the yields. Glyphosate applied late had only 5% reduction. And then we had Ingenia, which had about 16%. The Rustler, Liberty, and early glyphosate had almost in the mid-range. Bactrill M, I was surprised, affected about close to 50% yield reduction. And as expected, Infinity and Odyssey had 60% reduction in yield. So these are herbicides. If they are to be applied in your neighborhood, you may want to talk to your neighbors. Protecting yourself. How do you protect yourself? So I suggest that, and people do it, to maintain proper pesticide logs. In case of litigations, these spray logs are basically required if you're going through litigation or you want to protect yourself. And there are many details to be kept for that. Inform the neighbors, talk to them that you have a sensitive crop close to theirs, and also be aware what are the neighboring crops, and it could help in the avoidance of the problem. So what can be done if there is a seed carryover that is suspected? One of the first things is to inform the certification officials, crop consultants, if you have any, and also the seed seller, because they need to know that there has been a possible suspicion here. It is important to take the samples as soon as possible and get them analyzed for herbicide residues. Unfortunately, in many cases, the resolution for detection is often higher than the levels which may still be producing symptoms in the field. For example, glyphosate resolution in some of the labs is about 10 parts per billion, but symptoms can be expressed at this or below this level, and sometimes below detectable limits. And so it is important. So in summary, I would say I've done simulated herbicide drifts in 3-4 years. What I found was the symptoms on the foliage or leaves were quite diagnostic for a specific herbicide or herbicide group. Tubers did have growth cracks, rough skin, malformation, but for me, none were diagnostic for a specific herbicide or a specific growth. Uh, the early exposure of herbicides affect the current season yields and tuber quality. Late season, on the other hand, may not show you much loss, but it can be a big issue for seed because the herbicides get translocated into the bulking potatoes. And finally, it is important to keep log of the pesticide applications in case there are some litigation issues. I thank you very much for your time. And this is one of the field plots in Winkler. Thank you.
Thanks, Vikram. You did a great job. Those pictures were really helpful to see because I know it's hard to understand what's happening unless you actually see it, the symptoms sometimes. And remember, everyone listening in, if you have any questions for the presenters, please type these into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and we'll address them during the question and answer session following the presentations. And reminder, we will show the CACA code on the screen after the presentations are finished. So next up, we have Andy Robinson, who is the Extension Potato Agronomist at North Dakota State University and the University of Minnesota. Andy grew up farming in Parma, Idaho with his family. He received a bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University and his master and doctorate degrees from Purdue University. Andy's research and extension goals are to develop science-based solutions to address real-world problems in potato production, enabling producers to increase economic and environmental sustainability through improved crop management. Potato producers throughout the world can follow him on the NDSU/U of M Potato Extension website. And Andy contributes regularly to the Valley Potato Grower, writing Andy's advice. His work has taken him around the globe speaking, conducting research, and providing education. This work has been acknowledged by being awarded the Spudman Emerging Leader Award, the Myron and Muriel Johnsrud Excellent in Extension Award, Communicator of the Year Award from NDSU Extension. And he enjoys traveling and spending time in nature with his wife, Michelle, and 5 children. Take it away, please, Andy.
All right. Well, it's good to be here today. Thank you, everybody, for coming. So I'm going to try to add a little bit more to what Vikram talked about today. So I'm going to get a little bit more into the modes of action of some of these herbicides and how they work and function, which will help you understand some of the symptomology that you might see. I'll also discuss a little bit on soil residuals and how to protect your crop. So I think the first thing to think about when we're talking about injury to potato tubers is we need to understand how some of these herbicides work. So there are herbicides that are contact-only herbicides. Those would be products that have things such as dicot in them that we use to maybe vine kill. They don't move through the plant. They just kill and act where they touch. And then there's those that translocate through the plant. And so the primary ones, like Vikram talked about, you're going to see issues with in tubers are going to be your group 2, group 4s, and even group 9, which is your glyphosate. So those are the primary ones typically we deal with as far as herbicide injury in potatoes goes. So where do you look when you have injury? So typically you're going to visually see injury in the leaves. Sometimes you'll see it in the tubers, sometimes you won't. It depends a lot on the environment, the timing, the product that's used that is exposed on the plant. So there's a lot of things you really need to look at, and having somebody that can help. Sometimes if you're not very comfortable with it, is important to do, calling your agronomist or extension personnel or whoever might be available to help you out. So anyways, let's get into here. So injury, if I break this down, if you look at your group 2s, your PGRs, you're typically going to see injury pretty rapidly, usually within a week. The lower the amount that the plant is exposed to, the longer it might take to show up. Whereas your group 4s, that's your PGRs, your group 2s and your group 9s, your glyphosate and your LS inhibitors and SUs and things like that, they're going to typically take longer based on the mode of action and how they function in the plant. And that might take 2 or 3 weeks sometimes for those to show up, those symptoms. So what do you do when you find herbicide damage? And so this is, I think, something very important I think growers need to remember is when you do find it or somebody sees a scout or whoever it is in the field, it's really important to document it right away. There's a nice extension article NDSU has on this about how to document suspected herbicide damage. So it's good for you, number one, to make records of this, but also if you have a governmental agency that will come and investigate too, that can also be very important. Because for me, in my work as an extension specialist, my job is to educate. So I help growers understand what's going on, what the problem is, but I have no authority to enforce any laws or rules. And that, to me, where I'm at, goes to the state, the Department of Ag. They're the ones that have rules and can enforce them. They have the authority to do that. So it's important to note these symptoms, to contact the proper channels if needed, if something major is happening. Because usually in potatoes, when there's injury, there's a lot of money involved. And the reason why you do this right away is because over time, those injury symptoms, they will lessen. You'll get new leaves sometimes that grow over them. They might disappear. Then all of a sudden it becomes difficult to find, or it even may be difficult to find in a laboratory test as the plant breaks down those products. So let's talk specifically about some of the symptoms you'll see from different modes of action. So for the growth regulators of group 4s, you're going to see what we often refer to as epinasty, and that is kind of this twisting, curling, bubbling, wrinkling of the stems, leaflets. Sometimes you'll get this parallel veination where the veins, instead of going away from that midrib, will kind of more almost line up with that midrib vein. But you'll see this twisting. It's very common. People are very aware of what this looks like. What happens to the tubers? Well, with 2,4-D injury, you'll often see, especially this is more so on russet varieties, less so on the smooth skin potatoes. But 2,4-D, you're going to tend to see maybe deeper eyes, maybe slightly smaller tubers. Sometimes, often, I guess you could say, we use it in red potatoes. A low dose of 2,4-D is used to actually increase anthocyanins to maintain that red color of the skin. But it's not a 2,4-D. It's kind of interesting because in the U.S. there is a label that allows, I think it's up to 50 parts per billion is allowed in the tuber. So that's always the issue with most herbicides, is if you get herbicides into a tuber, what are the food safety levels that are allowed to have? So some products have a level, some don't. So you have to check with your country, your state rules. As far as seed, Vikram mentioned, we've never seen 2,4-D carryover in seed. We've done multiple replicated studies of this and haven't seen it happen. So as far as carryover of 2,4-D in seed, hasn't been found. Dicamba is a little bit different compound. It's becoming more and more of an issue because of the amount of acres that dicamba is being applied to. And so typically you're going to get the similar symptoms of 2,4-D, the epinasty, but they're going to be slightly more severe. And you can see what they call often a fiddle neck, or these top of these leaves twisting just straight over. And sometimes it will completely inhibit the growth of new leaflets or new leaves. And so as you go from 2,4-D to dicamba, and then you get into some of the like clopyralids or picklearms, it just gets worse and worse, the amount of symptoms you get by the lower the rate goes and the longevity of them in potatoes. So dicamba can cause some pretty ugly tubers, especially when it's earlier in the growing development of the tubers. So typically, like Rick mentioned, that early to mid bulking, as those tubers continue to grow and expand, when you disrupt that growth, you'll get bigger growth cracks and fissures along those tubers because that tuber is growing quite rapidly, and that's just a result of what happens from that herbicide disrupting the growth. And then as far as carryover in seed, yes, it carries over. We've seen it carry over where the whole entire plant looks like it was drifted on, or sometimes I've seen the plants emerge. They look fine the first 3 or 4 leaves, and then all of a sudden start expressing symptoms. But yeah, you'll see that random effect through the field with the seed residue issue. You get into glyphosate, typically you're going to see, again, this is translocates to the growing spots, the newest leaves, and also down the tubers and the roots. And so that's why you typically see the yellowing on the leaflets and the leaves. It typically will stunt the plant growth and just reduce overall production. Tubers can become really ugly. These are pretty severe cases here from our research trials, but typically it can cause, again, cracking and malformations of tubers earlier happens in the season. Elephant hide also is something that's very common with exposure to glyphosate. So in the seed, yeah, you can get this kind of crazy assortment of different symptoms from glyphosate. When I'm looking for this in the field, I'm usually looking for 2 or 3 of these symptoms, because if you're just looking like at an erratic emergence pattern, that could be caused by a lot of different things. You could have rot of your seed, you could have a lot of other things going on to cause that. But when I see an erratic emergence pattern, plus if I dig up tubers and you see multiple stems coming out of an eye, the one picture here again is a very extreme case, but most potato growers know that having probably more than 2 or 3 stems coming out of an eye is not natural. And so, anyways, you start seeing some of these symptoms, you start putting the pieces together. Okay, this could be an issue. It's not something I did. You get into some of what we call the ME herbicides. These typically cause more issues with soil carryover because of the longevity they have in the soil. And it's going to cause symptoms such as yellowing of leaves, kind of elongated leaves with almost a boat tip shape at the end. As you can see, these are, if you look at the tubers, you can get smaller tubers, you can have knobs, cracks, sometimes banana, pear shape. So it varies a bit, again, based on the variety, the amount of product that they're exposed to, etc. You get onto the sulfonylureas, again, you're going to get cracking, you're going to get smaller tubers, maybe pear-shaped or banana-type shaped potato tubers. Again, all undesirable, and they're coals, and they can't be sold and marketed for anything. So with a lot of herbicides, you're typically going to get cracking of tubers just because you're disrupting that growth in the potato plant. And then again, this is just an example. This is clomazone. This is a contact herbicide, kind of like the diquat example I was talking about earlier, where it doesn't move through the plant, but it can disrupt growth and it can disrupt the photosynthase. They're being pushed to the tubers, and that can cause tubers to crack and become malformed. So it doesn't mean the product's in the tuber, but it could disrupt the growth enough to cause, again, tubers that are unmarketable. And then just keep in mind, too, every time I give one of these talks about herbicides, everybody likes to find every problem and call it a herbicide injury. But this is where you have to be careful, because there's a lot of things that can cause tubers to become malformed, cracked, and not look right. And so environmental stressors certainly can cause cracked tubers. Some people claim nutritional imbalance can do this. Diseases have been shown and reported in multiple research papers to show that tubers crack. And then also your genetics. You can have varieties that are more prone to cracking. And so tuber cracking can be caused by a lot of things. Herbicide is just one of them. And so again, I think that's why it's important to look at your foliar symptomologies, look at spray records, knowing what's around your field even. So sometimes it's putting a puzzle together through all the different things that are going on to figure out what the most likely candidate is, and then even testing those tubers afterwards. So we have this poster here that we put together at NDSU, and we can get you a short link for that if you want, but it's available for download for free. But just kind of gives some pictures of what some of these different herbicide injury symptoms look like based on the different modes of action that are out there, and just kind of give you an idea. But again, like I said, a lot of these products are just going to cause tubers to crack because it disrupts growth, and so that's pretty common. And the severity will vary tremendously based on the rate that's applied, or that the plant's exposed to, the environment, the variety, etc. So there's a lot of things that affect this. But this is just kind of a short guide that can be utilized. So speaking of soil carryover, this can certainly happen as well. And probably the biggest thing to me is really looking at the labels, because a lot of research has been conducted on labels to give a really good understanding of when you should be able to plant back safely. And so to me, that's number one. When growers call me and ask me if it's okay to plant a potato following a certain herbicide that was applied, and it's still within that window of you shouldn't apply, because don't ask me for permission to apply when it's still not labeled to apply, because I'm never going to say you can, because you need to follow the label. There's too much money and time and effort involved in potatoes that you don't need to risk that potential injury. And so soil carryover is affected by a lot of things. Microbial activity is primarily the main function that breaks down a lot of these products. And so that is usually increased when you have warmer temperatures and moisture. And so things such as dryness, cooler temperatures, lots of organic matter can tend to cause more herbicides to carry over in general. So this is just an example here. This is clopyralid that was actually sprayed in this field previously, and this is a low spot, and it kind of actually, some of these products are also more water soluble when they move. And so this is a spot where it kind of accumulated, and this is what the plants look like from that carryover. So here's another soil carryover situation where some product was applied the previous year in a contaminated tank and caused soil carryover problems in this field. And so this is an IMI herbicide. You can see the bottle brushing of the roots, which is a classical symptomology of this class of herbicides. And again, not very healthy plants, not good. So this is a case where a spray boom was cleaned out in the field with a Mazamox. And again, there was so much there that it carried over to the next year of potatoes. So we do have cases like this too, sometimes where you're not, you have to, again, not everything is herbicide related. And that's where, again, we have to be careful and make sure we understand what's going on in the situation. So this is a situation where actually the field on the left, where you see the potatoes growing, this is all the same variety planted the same date. But on the left, that was fumigated with metam sodium, and on the right, that was non-fumigated. And there's a nematode issue in this field. And so that's why we see that different. There's nothing to do with herbicides in this case. And so this is just more pictures from that, what the nematodes did. This is not herbicide. So what do you do about some of these herbicide issues, right? So it's really important to know field history. Try to get at least 2 or 3 years worth of records, because some products can carry over for a long time. So it's important to look at that, especially if it's not a field you've ever grown potatoes in. A lot of land renting and swapping happens with potato production because of our long rotations. Make sure your seed is certified and of good quality. Make sure when you're spraying that you use good spray techniques. A lot of the seed growers I work with, most of them actually now, they have a separate sprayer. If they're growing other crops outside of seed potatoes, they have a separate sprayer they use for their seed potatoes, and they do all the rest of their crops because there's too much risk involved. And you find out fast too, if you accidentally don't clean out your tank or hurt your seed potatoes, you could buy a few sprayers for the cost of that mistake. And so it's really good insurance to have a separate sprayer. And then again, if something looks suspicious in your fields, document it right away, take pictures, do everything you need to. So we put together a little publication here at NDSU, how to sample. So if you suspect herbicide injury in your potatoes, here's a guide that you can follow if you want. You can download it here at the short link, z.umn.edu/injury. But basically the steps are, you want to document it, you want to sample it. If you want to do a chain of custody, especially if you're concerned about potential litigation, that's a good way to just ensure that the sample is, documented the whole way through into the laboratory. So just cleaning the sample, usually if there's dirt or soil on it, and then getting it shipped to a laboratory. So anyways, that's kind of a quick rundown on some of the herbicide injury stuff we have and what to do about it. But the important thing too is just to communicate with your neighbors. If there's issues, communicate with them, let them know you have potatoes nearby and they're sensitive, and try your best to, stay out of it, because nobody really ever wins when there's these herbicide issue cases. The person that might have misapplied the product, they're going to lose, you're going to lose, and there's really no winners. And so the best thing to do is try to avoid this as best possible. So appreciate your time, and we're happy to take questions, I think, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andy. That was a great presentation. I found you and Vikram's presentations really kind of built off each other and were great complementary pieces. So I learned a lot listening. And yeah, as Andy said, let's start the question and answer session. If you have a question for either of our presenters that you haven't typed in yet, please type it in the chat box now. So I'm going to start off with one question. So you guys both showed a lot of pictures of Vikram, you showed a lot of pictures of potato plants that had herbicide injury, and Andy, you showed pictures of both tubers and plants that had herbicide injury. So I know you guys did say that a lot of the time you can see the herbicide injury on the leaves before harvest, but is there any instances where you may not see herbicide injury until you do harvest and dig up those spuds and see it on the tuber?
Yeah, one of the examples that I gave was the glyphosate applied on different crops for dry down or weed control in, say, canola or wheat. Some of that gets drifted onto the potatoes. Uh, there is no visible symptoms on the potatoes at that late stage, but enough of that material goes into the potatoes, and we have had a lot of issues in different provinces that I have gotten called for, and they are basically herbicide glyphosate applied late in the season, and you only realize that next year. And in many cases, by the time the plants have come up, uh, the grower took the samples, but rather late in one case, and the pesticide or the herbicide was below detectable limits, yet there were symptoms on the emerging plants. So yes, there are many cases like that.
Thank you. And Andy, is there anything else you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I think the other thing to keep in mind too on these translocating herbicides, if it's a determinate growth pattern that that plant has and it stopped growing leaves, you're not going to see it in the leaves. It's going to all get moved to the tubers. And so you have late season, but you also have determinate plants that won't express it. And the other thing to keep in mind too is sometimes the rate is so low that the expression of the symptoms is so minimal that you may miss it. To an untrained eye, you may not see some of these symptoms that are so slight that it may be missed, or within 3 or 4 days, the symptomology is already gone and you miss it too. So that can happen as well.
Thank you. And just everyone, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. Another question I have is, of course, you guys talked about how a lot of times these potatoes, if they do have herbicide injury, they will be rejected by processors or other buyers. So what can you do? Are like these potatoes still able to be edible? Would you be able to maybe sell them in the ugly potato movement, or are these mainly just sent for cattle feed or something?
Well, I think it depends on what is legally allowed. So in the United States, the Environmental Protection Agency labels they have basically a list of how many parts per million of a product can be in a food product, right? So if you exceed that value, then you cannot sell it for food or for feed. And so that's where you run into some big problems. If you can't sell it, then that's when you have a lot of trouble. And so, so that's why, yeah, sometimes these things get pretty challenging because you can't do anything with it at times. Sometimes if it's like, say, glyphosate in seed, if it's a seed crop, you could always grow it back the next year, because if you get exposed one year and then you grow it the next year and you see the symptoms, so the granddaughter tubers, I've never seen glyphosate carry over 2 generations, only one. And so there's some strategies you can use that way. But if it's a commercial crop, there's not much you can do if it's above food safety tolerance levels.
And I understand that the processors would randomly select lots for herbicide check, and if they find something over the MRLs, then they would basically reject the loads or do something else, but not use it.
Thank you, guys. And how do you safely dispose then of a potato crop if it's rejected due to the amount of residue in it?
I think that question is best answered by the growers themselves. But yes, in case it's a very, you can say the residual effect is very high, then it should not be put in a next season's potato field, but it could be composted or disposed of in a field which would be, say, field crops, or basically put into the compost piles.
Okay, well, thank you, guys. Now we're showing the CCA credit code on screen. So if you just want to scan it with your device, and hopefully that works. But if you have any trouble with scanning the code, you can email me at arobinson@seedworldgroup.com. And please include your name and your CCA number in the email, and I will make sure that you get that credit. So yeah, thank you guys so much. Also, just a reminder, this is being recorded, so you will be able to go back and watch this if there's any parts that you missed or anything, or and of course the code will be shown then, so you guys can get credit for watching it later. I'll just leave it up there for another minute.
It was very interesting. I got a couple of texts from friends from India who were listening in. So it is good that Spud Smart has a wide reach.
Oh, that's great to hear. And hello to those tuning in from India. We're so happy to have you here today. Okay, and well, thank you guys so much. Thank you to both Vikram and Andy for being on here today. And thank you so much to McCain for sponsoring it. I'm just thankful for all you guys' support. We can never do these webinars without people like Vikram and Andy volunteering their time to help out. And then, of course, McCain helping us to make sure to bring this to all of you listening in. And of course, a big thank you goes out to all those who have participated in today's webinar. I hope you found this information valuable. And again, a recording of this webinar will be made available on spudsmart.com shortly after. And thanks again, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Ashley and Spud Smart.
Thank you, Vikram.